Okay, good evening and welcome to tonight's committee meeting. My name is Councillor Patrick Walsh and I am the chair of the Audit Committee. A few housekeeping points before we begin. Firstly, this meeting is being live streamed on the Council's YouTube channel. By participating, you are consenting to being recorded. If the fire alarm sounds, please leave the meeting in an orderly fashion by the fire exit, which is behind me on the right. Officers will direct you to the assembly point on Riverside Gardens. And please can officers and guests introduce themselves when they first address the committee. And please ensure to speak into the microphone as well. Right, apologies for absence, and apologies for absence have been received from Councillor Adrian Pascoe-Tilbury, as well as the Chief Executive, Sharon Lee. Item 2, declarations of interest. Do members have any declarations of interest?
No.
Okay. Item 3, do members agree to the previous meeting or to the agenda of the previous meeting held on the 9th of December 2024 as a true and accurate record?
Agreed.
Excellent. In that case, moving along to item 4, internal audit strategy 2025 to 28, charter and mandate. Can I ask Maura Mackey to introduce the report? And also attending on this item is David Hughes. So over to you two.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm Maura Mackey, the Head of Internal Audit. Just to give you a very, very brief background about why this paper's come to you today. Further along on in your agenda, there's an information item, item 8, which is all about these new global internal audit standards. So to just summarise what these are, as they say, they're global. So they are meant to be applied across the internal audit sector, across the whole world. But they are a little bit private sector focused. So what's happened is the Accounting Standards Board through SITFA have done some interpretation for us to help us because obviously the public sector has some differences with the private sector. For example, there's a lot of references to things like the board. So we need to interpret them for you so that you know what the standards mean for us in us doing our job. They detail the roles and responsibilities of yourselves as the audit committee, which is the board effectively from the standards, and what our roles and responsibilities are as your internal auditors and how we should behave. It covers the ethics. It's all about how we behave in the work that we do so that you can then be satisfied that we are doing the right thing for you in reporting what we find and that we're clear and transparent in what we produce for you. And we have that relationship with you that means we can come to you if we've got any concerns, which is really important, that you have that right to go to the board, the committee, if there are any issues of concern, and rightfully that you can come to us as well. So that's a very short summary about a very long document, which is the standards. David's given some background in, say, item 8 about the standards, but we obviously have to apply those. They are applicable already in the UK from January 2025, but for the public sector, they're implementing them from the 1st of April. Because it ties in with our financial years. And we wanted to make sure that you could see how we're going to do that, how we're going to apply the standards. One of the things we need to have is a charter. We do have a charter at the moment, but it needed to be refreshed to be more aligned with the new standards. And we also have to identify, and they're very clear, what our mandate is. So that's why we've completely refreshed all of our documents. The strategy is a lot more detailed. It's meant to show how we're going to achieve certain things over a period of time, showing continuous improvement. And that's what we've got here for you today. So the standards require you to review our strategy and by all means provide us with feedback on that. And we will report to you on progress on that as well. On the charter mandate, we do actually need your approval. It doesn't have to be approved every year, but it should be discussed with you and approved on I can't remember the actual term, is it a regular basis? But it's not determined. But since this is such a big change, different way of setting things out. We want you to actually see it and approve it at this meeting.
Thank you, Moira. Do members of the committee have any questions? Councillor Morton.
Yes, thank you for that. Item 15 says there are no legal implications arising from this. What are our legal obligations in the event that there was fraud involved? I'm not saying there would, but should something go wrong, what liability do we have as the board that signed this off?
Yeah, so under the Accounts and Audit Regulations 2015, the council is required to have robust arrangements in place for risk management, internal control, and protect against fraud. So that's something that Sukhvinder as the Section 151 officer has overarching responsibility for, but that's why I report to him in terms of how we discharge that through the internal audit and counter-fraud functions. So Accounts and Audit Regulations 2015 are the thing which actually govern that from a legislative point of view. Sorry, in terms of... Oh, sorry, so
yeah, I was asking what if there was any personal liability attached to us as signing off your.
So under the council's insurance policies, which I also have responsibility for separately, all officers and members are covered in carrying out their duties and performance those duties as part of the council.
Right, thank you.
Any other? Councillor Chivot-Verdier.
Thank you, Chair. Well, there's a lot of good stuff in there. Some of my favourite sections, page 19. Reaffirming our commitment to providing independent, value-adding assurance while supporting the council in achieving its objectives. Page 22, establishing a mentorship framework to develop leadership capabilities, cultivate future leaders. Page 22, leveraging technology for enhanced delivery, and that's, of course, caught my eye. I was wondering if you could give us examples of how you're planning on, obviously this is a blueprint stage, you shouldn't have concrete plans now, but could you give this committee examples of how you're planning on using technology to improve the delivery of your services?
Very much. Thank you, Councillor Chivot-Verdier. So one of the things we are working on already is how we use data analytics to help us in terms of our audit works. This has a number of benefits in terms of how you can look at the whole population of data for an area that you're carrying an audit out of. You can look for anomalies, you can look for trends, you can look for instances which you would want to pick up to see if there's compliance. We already work closely with the council's corporate BI team, so there's a number of, particularly on the counter fraud side, the fraud reduction, error and waste sort of hub that has been created, lots of internal data being collated together to look again for potential issues around fraud. When we come onto the audit plan, you'll notice we're looking at how we develop our continuous audit approach. This again is in part data driven. So again, using tools we already have at our disposal, but also looking at where we can use data analytics more widely to assess and look and give assurance more quickly, more efficiently, in a less costly way, so that we can actually track and highlight whether there are potential concerns, things going off track. So again, shifting some of our resource that we apply to some large audits to do some of that continuous audit work using data analytics is a really important part of that.
Yeah, can I ask, it's quite a general question actually, and then a sort of question particular to Hammersmith and Fulham. In terms of the private sector, so you said this is a global standard, it goes all across the private sector. Can I ask what size company it applies to? Because obviously this is quite a big task. So is it all companies?
So my understanding is it globally applies in every country, whatever the audit requirements are for companies. So it will vary from country to country.
And is that new in the UK from this financial year?
This new standard is the previous standards, which came out in 2019, 18. Yeah, similarly applied globally, but these apply to companies now from this year across.
So from the point of view of if we're using contractors,
yes, yeah,
that could be actually quite helpful because there is now so we could actually look at our contractors' strategies.
Indeed, you could indeed.
Okay, so that was my very general question. Just wanted to clear that up. And then can I just pick up on page 23 and 24 where we're talking about measuring success? I'm assuming the aim would be for this to come back to this committee in March in these following years to just see how we're doing against this?
So we would look to report in the Head of Audit annual opinion report, which comes in the June, but also if there are instances where we think we're going off track, we'd come back and talk to you about what corrective action we're taking. So rather than waiting until the year end and saying, actually, yeah, it was all fine, or actually, no, this bit wasn't, we'd want to make sure during the year we were raising any issues with you as well. So absolutely that transparency at year end, and then anything else in between that warranted.
And just to come back to my first point, do we look at the risk assessments of our contractors? Is that part of our contract? I don't know if anybody in here will know the answer to that question.
That's something that is done through contract management. It's something periodically when we do contract management audits we would look for. So again, that's something again. So I know Jules, particularly on the risk management side, we'll be looking at departments and how they're managing their risks with their large suppliers. So with their high profile suppliers or large suppliers who are helping to provide services, that will form part of the work that officers in contract management should be feeding into departmental registers as well. But we certainly give independent assurance as well when we look at contract management on key contracts.
Okay, it'd be interesting to know how often something's flagged. Maybe,
Yes, indeed, yeah.
in when we're looking at contracts. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Holman. Are there any other questions? Okay, in that case, let's move to the recommendations. And there are two recommendations in this case. Recommendation 1 is to note the draft internal audit strategy, which can be found at Appendix 1. And recommendation 2, to approve the draft internal audit charter and mandate as set out in Appendix 2. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Fabulous. Okay, in that case, we move along to item 5, the internal audit plan for 25-26. And back to yourselves, Maura and David again.
Thank you, Chair. As we have done in the past, we're reporting a very early draft of the internal audit plan. For those of you who are newish to the committee, we don't set out a whole list of audits that we're going to do in the next 12 months, because what we would find is that by the time we've had all the meetings to confirm what we need to look at, half of them would disappear from the plan because priorities change, risks change, systems change, all sorts of things. People move on and it all gets very complicated. So we've done this probably since about 2021, I think it is. We've been a lot more flexible. So we're only really looking at a quarter in advance, but we're also mindful of what we think we want to look at later in the year, but we still have more meetings to have. It's an ongoing process. And as I say, things change. And we're also trying to build in some more continuous type auditings, which will cover some of the areas that we traditionally might have done a one-off audit on. So, for example, we might have previously looked at something in health and safety in isolation, but if we can get better at doing the continuous auditing, we don't necessarily need to do a single audit in that area going forward. So this is our plan. There's lots of things to consider. We've identified, so this is in the Appendix 1, we've identified some areas for continuous auditing I mentioned. These are subject possibilities, a little bit of work to be done on them, discussions with relevant parties who hold the data, what we could do. We won't be able to do everything in a year. And then we've also identified areas that we want to get some coverage on. So we try to break it down into categories there. So you'd be looking to see some work in all of those areas, and we will make sure you know what those areas are. And then we move on to some audits that we've already confirmed. Some of them have got dates already, including in Q3. That's because we know that will happen. But the others, there's still quite a few to be discussed, areas to be discussed, and this will evolve. And what we will do is make sure that you get an up-to-date plan as we move through the year. And that will also be recorded in our assurance reporting to you during the year, so you can see what we've covered and what we hope to cover. And if we haven't covered something, there's a reason for it. So it's really just for any feedback, any areas that you may feel that we definitely need to look at, so we can go away, have those conversations and plan that in. Or if there's something in here that you think, why is that there? What's the risk? What's the issue here? So it's really just for some feedback and to give you an indication of what we're going to be looking at the beginning of the year primarily, but also a little bit of coverage going into the year ahead.
Thank you, Maura. Do members of the committee have any questions? Councillor Holman.
Thank you, Chair. Could I ask about building control? That's something that you've got highlighted in a couple of places. In one place it says changes in legislation. I think the reason I ask about that is because I think it's one that's of interest to the public. Quite often as councillors, we do get inquiries around building control, usually post planning, when they say, you know, planning's been given, but what was in the planning application has not been applied. So I'm just wondering how we plan to look at that and if that is definitely likely to be something we do manage to look at this year.
Yeah, sorry.
So we were hoping to maybe do something this year on that, but we had a conversation with the department about it. And there have been a lot of changes, as you know, over the regulations and that, and who can actually sign off things, but I'll let you cover that, David. But we agreed with them that it would be better to do it next year from after April. And I believe that timing has even been agreed for us to actually, so I'm pretty sure that's going to happen. But they have had quite a lot of changes, and I think they had to do a bit of recruitment as well in that area.
So one of the things, obviously, the learning from the Grenfell Tower tragedy was the failings and the findings around building control. So you now have the building safety regulator who carries out audits of building control functions. So again, we want to help the service there to make sure they're prepared for that. There are new requirements in terms of training, in terms of supervision, in terms of quality management. We want to make sure in place. I think on the planning side, we have done work in the past and happy to look at that again, where we look at where there's follow through from, as you say, from planning permission through to the inspections that are then carried out. So I think that applies on building regs and on planning applications, which we can take away and have a look at to see that there's that focus on follow through by the service as well.
My understanding is one of the issues with building control is that the developers can actually contract it out. So it's not necessarily directly the council's responsibility. And I think that is an area of friction sometimes between what residents feel the council can do and what we can actually do. And there is an issue of who gets paid to do the building control and we don't as well. So I think that's quite an interesting area to look at and what risk it is to us financially, actually.
Indeed, I think that's a really good point, Councillor Holman. So you're probably aware in terms of the Grenfell inquiry report, the inquiry recommended the government undertake a review of this role, the dual role between local authority building control and approved inspectors in the private sector as to whether there should be one way of delivering building control nationally. I think, that's something that we'll obviously await the outcome of that, but building control still have, even if they're not appointed to do the building control, building regulation application, still have a regulatory and an enforcement role as well. So residents there should be able to contact building control to get their advice and support as well. So again, something we can have a look at when we look at the service as well.
I think that'd be welcome. Thank you.
Councillor Chivot-Verdier.
Thank you, Chair. Well, yes, a big yes to the agile approach of 3+9. I think it enables us to sort of react to changes around us and shifting priorities, events, whether national or local. Obviously, I think personally, as far as future updates are concerned, I'll be very much looking forward to hearing more about continuous auditing and how you're using technologies, what that has helped us in our everlasting quest to achieve better value for money, and how it's ensuring that your teams are performing even more in the face of a increase in auditing demands from central government. So yeah, don't hesitate in future updates to show this committee what tools you're using, how they're built. I think that we've got a very powerful BI team that sits under the excellent cabinet member for finance and reform, and we'll be excited to find out more about this.
Are there any other? I did have one question just regarding, you kind of touched on it at the start of your introduction there, more about people moving on. And certainly looking at this as quite a wide scoping, and I'm generalizing here. If there is people moving on in such a large organization like this, are you confident that there's enough access that you can get to complete those audits, or is there a risk here where these have to be deferred again due to that kind of turnover?
I mean, sometimes it is best to wait, because if you get new people coming in, there's sometimes different ways of doing things. But generally speaking, I don't feel it's a particularly big issue. There's usually somebody there that can support us do the audit. And quite often, even if we change perhaps the scope of the work to maybe be more supportive and advisory, because they're in a state of change, so that they can then use that to get to where they need to be, and then we can do an assurance piece later. So that is something that we do consider. So we might not do an assurance piece at that time, but we may provide some advice to help them through a period of change, which could be people, it could be a system, it could be legislation.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that obviously, these are being published now as the plan, and where at a later date, if it happens where you're coming back to say, we're not able to provide assurances, but to make sure that that's explicitly clarified. So it's less of a reflection to say that there's a particular ongoing issue, it's just more reflective of the on-the-ground situation in that particular section. I think. Sukhvinder, did you want to come in?
I did. Thank you very much, Chair. It was just a general comment to say really that the plan that David and Maura and the team have set out is very comprehensive, as you can see, and covers all the services across the council and all the key activities overall. In that sense, it should help to provide you assurance that all the systems, processes, procedures are strong and robust. And it'll also reinforce that our external stakeholders, particularly the external auditors, rely on David's work to provide assurance to the financial statements of the council. So I'd like to thank you and the team for that. And I'm hoping that committee will agree to the overall proposal set out here in the report.
Thank you, Sukhvinder. I think that's a very good point to make. If there's no final questions from members of the committee, I'm going to move to recommendations. And there are two recommendations for this. The first recommendation is to note the early draft of the annual audit plan as set out in Appendix 1, and the audit work due to be undertaken in the first quarter of 25-26, and identify any specific audits to be considered during the coming year. And two, to note the draft strategic audit plan and set out in Appendix 2, and consider it covers the present risks that the council faces and outlines the business areas and themes that need to be considered as part of the audit plan. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Moving along to item 6, can I ask David Hughes to introduce the risk management strategy 25-28, and also attending on this item is Jules. So over to yourselves, guys.
Thank you, Chair. And it's good to bring along the new risk management strategy to you this evening. So the last iteration was in 2019, which was just before COVID happened. So it's good to recognise the evolution of risk management globally, and particularly in the public sector in light of the pandemic, the kind of economic situation we've had in the last few years, and world events. I think risk management has changed a lot. What is good to report out, actually, this strategy is something that is very much about how we embed risk management culture in the organisation, and that's something that we do well at Hammersmith and Fulham already. There's really good engagement from particularly SLT and the Chief Executive, and from directorates, which I think is really important. And also we get good support from you as a committee as well, which I think is really helpful. So as with the audit charter, it's important that we have the committee's approval to demonstrate the commitment you've got to embedding good risk management in the council. Bringing this here to be able to say to the organisation, to all staff, this is something you as a committee have approved is really important. In paragraph 4, we set out some of the organisational benefits of having effective risk management arrangements in place. So, effective decision making, improving service delivery, continuous improvement, as well as obviously keeping our residents safe in the borough. Paragraph 6 summarises the structure of the strategy, which is set out in Appendix 1 from page 60 in your pack. Once you've approved the strategy, and we obviously welcome feedback as well this evening, we'll be rolling out training and awareness for all staff and managers in how to use the risk management strategy. We're going to be providing a risk management toolkit, which is a how-to sort of a set of tools to help the organisation to really embed risk management well. That will set out our expectations on how risk management should be done, and also will support senior management and service teams in maintaining their risk registers. Now, it's important to recognise the strategy defines the roles and responsibilities of all staff and members in respect of risk management. So I think this is a whole organisation. I think it's really important to state that. We've included hopefully a clear risk appetite statement. So again, how do we appropriately take tolerating risks which are a threat or not, or treating them, but also how we take opportunity risks when they arise as well, particularly around investment in the borough. The document also sets out the governance and reporting arrangements and how we go about providing oversight and assurance for management of risk. I just want to finish with what I think is the key feature in this document, which we've not had before, and that's we're going to bring you an annual assurance report on risk management arrangements. So specifically detailing how the strategy is being adopted, how it's being used, how it's embedded and how it's working. So I think it's good for us to do that on an annual basis to bring back to you to give you assurance that the strategy you've approved and we've adopted is actually working in practice. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, David. Jules, is there anything you wanted to?
No. It's more to say that this is a great opportunity to come up with something that actually really benefits the council and benefits the way we work. It is built based on experience and knowledge of the entire industry, and we are confident that this we can actually get a proper result. We can get even more control over our risks and awareness going forward, so you and the residents can be better informed.
Thank you, Jules. Thank you, David. Do members of the committee have any questions? Councillor Chivot-Verdier.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I really enjoyed the focus on all staff, all elected members, just like fire safety, just like data protection, and that's a responsibility that falls on all of us, and we can play our part in this. That was a very positive thing to see. In other committees, and I won't badmouth them here, I all love them equally, but we sometimes get statutory requirements for engagement, and sometimes the engagement isn't, let's say it's a variety of levels of engagement. You talked about engagement from internal teams, from directors. Tell us more about the way that teams internally in a council engage with you, and do you feel that you get the input that you need from them?
I think we do. I think it's something we can always improve on. So I know Jules and myself in particular, yeah, and Moira as well, we have regular meetings with the directorate management teams. So particularly around the risk registers, we get quite heavily involved in the risk management arrangements on some of the key programs and projects council operates, which again is something that, you know, these are dynamic situations where you want to be clear that risk management is working well. I think we've got some work to do perhaps in the more junior ranks in the organisation to bring risk management to life. And that's where I think the training and e-learning and how we get to grips with that will be really important as we embed this new strategy. But I think we're in a good place, and we get good support from Sukhvinder, from Sharon as the Chief Executive and from SLT, and a good place to raise concerns there if there are any around the way risk is being managed. But I think, yeah, generally good place, but more we can do. Yeah.
Is there any questions? I just had a general question then, just regarding, obviously, we live in very interesting times. And there has been, you know, a lot of, let's say, unprecedented events. When you talk about a risk management toolbox, in your own kind of professional opinion, do you feel that there's the strength within that toolbox to, obviously we can't foresee every possible scenario, but that they are robust enough to respond to a lot of those kind of potential concerns coming forward?
I think we're on a journey there. So I think actually the training we'll do will actually help. It won't be, so talk and chalk type sessions. It will be about services actually thinking about the kind of risks they could be facing. So again, I think it's important we're helping staff to adopt this in practice rather than just here's the principle. So I think actually there's lots of good examples where that does happen already, but we've got opportunities through the training and learning program to make sure that's more widely happening and people are thinking outside the proverbial box in terms of the kind of risks they could be facing. We're also quite clear actually to make the difference between risks and issues. So often there's confusion around things that are actually issues, things that have happened already and we're managing, and it's important that we log those and we track those, but they're not risks. So it's again making sure the language is understood, the way in which we deal with those is understood as well by the organisation. But I think again, we're in a good place, but there's more we want to do with the organisation to really embed that.
Yeah, I'd say just to add to that, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Sukhvinder for his team who did a lot of work on sort of refreshing their risk register recently. But to pick up on what David said, yes, the way we're operating now is to identify and differentiate between a risk and an issue. You can never fully identify something before it comes along. You're always going to be caught out, but by implementing some of these strategies, we can be more fleet of foot when something comes up.
Yeah.
And also it mentions here is horizon scanning, which is like the third part, which is, it can be quite esoteric, is looking long term, what could happen, but at least it means we are able to identify the risks long term. And even if they're not put on the register, we know of the sorts of things that might take place, so we can adequately respond.
And that horizon scanning is something we'll build into the future risk reporting here as well. So it's not just looking at the risks that have been identified, but some of the things that in the sector, in local government, in the public sector, are things that are emerging that potentially could be facing us.
Councillor Shivapuri.
Thank you, Chair. Well, tell us more about how you engage with the sectors. I think that's that insights sharing and sort of industry collaboration. How does that feed into your work to build that strategy?
So we do a number of things. So we have a London network for heads of internal audit. So we're sharing expertise and knowledge both across London, and there's a local authority network across the UK for heads of audit as well. Because we use from time to time some of the private firms to do some of our internal audit work, they also produce materials around emerging risks. So we're able to tap in to those as well. And the Institute of Internal Auditors also each year produces a really good summary of the kind of emerging risks, not just for the UK or the UK public sector, but globally. So again, we're looking at not just from a sort of a provincial approach, as it were, but looking at it from a much wider base to see where risks in other sectors might be something we might be likely to see in local government as well. So I think we've got a range of avenues where we're well connected into to make sure. But I think, again, we can show some more of that to you as a committee going forward, so you can get the sense and assurance that we're doing that.
Thank you again, Chair. Well, yes, absolutely. I think it's really interesting. So through in the pensions committee, we'll get sort of where the fund managers tend to engage, where the conversations at, etc. Demonstrate how we sort of play ball with the other local authorities, where we receive, but we also share. And I think that's what LBHF is all about, sharing best practices. So thank you very much for that proposal. Yeah.
Thank you. And just to echo that, obviously, it's really encouraging to hear about that forward-thinking approach, horizon scanning. Obviously, as you say, we can't anticipate everything, but at least if we're in the mindset of looking ahead and doing what, to use the old expression, fixing the roof while the sun shines, we can weather many a storm ahead. Is there any final questions before we move on? Okay, in that case, I move to the recommendations. And there are two recommendations once again. First, to note and approve the risk management strategy 25 to 28, and to note the annual assurance report on risk management. Amendments will be presented at future meetings of the committee. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Excellent. Moving along to item 7, risk management update and corporate risk register for 24-25. And can I ask Jules and David to introduce again?
So I'll just start off, Chair, and I'll ask Jules to perhaps go into some of the risks. So obviously, we bring the register to you regularly. You'll notice some differences from last time we came, hopefully, which I'll talk through in a second. So in section 12, on page 75, we set out the changes to the register since the last quarter, where risks have either been introduced or have changed in the score. So we've got 3 new risks added, including one around Building Safety Act compliance, which we talked about earlier, and 2 covering different aspects of adults and children's services, which reflect primarily the national pressures on these services, which are being felt not just in Hammersmith and Fulham, but across the country. To let you know, there will be a further update on cybersecurity under exempt business at the June meeting. So that's something the committee have welcomed before. So there'll be another opportunity to have a detailed conversation there around risk management. We've increased the score on cybersecurity this time because this is in line with what other boroughs are doing in their risk registers, given the increase in incidents involving the public sector generally and local government in particular over the last period. Now, it's important to note that SLT Assurance have reviewed the register, and what we've done with them is to try and make sure it's more focused. So I think it got quite large before in terms of the narrative, so we've sought to really sort of focus the narrative both in terms of what the current arrangements are for each of the risks, but also to focus a bit more on what the planned mitigations that directors and officers are looking to take. And the reason for that is, going forward, it'd be good to have the conversation here at the committee with you and with those directors around how those planned mitigations are working. So are they working as intended? Have they had to do something different? Or how are they thinking about extra controls they need to put in place? So again, trying to get to a point where it helps you as a committee to seek to get more assurance about the active way in which risk management is happening and those sort of planned actions. So we'll be developing the template a bit further to make it more action focused when we come back in the autumn. But again, hopefully that will help you in terms of how we're tracking the delivery of those planned actions and making sure those mitigations are either maintaining or reducing risk. Now, sometimes cybersecurity is a good example where you're running fast to stand still. So again, it's important those mitigations are maintaining the risk at the level it's at. It's going to be difficult to reduce. There will be others where there's a natural cycle where actually those mitigations will reduce the risk over time. So I think it's the way in which we're changing the risk register, the way in which we'll change it further will help hopefully as a committee for you to get more of a sort of a sense of that, but also to the opportunity, if you want to deep dive into particular risks at particular meetings, again, the opportunity to do that. I don't know if Jules, has anything you want to add in terms of the register generally or anything particularly you want to pick up?
No, David, covered it more than adequately there. I'd say the only thing is that one of the risks dropped off, which was a risk concerning Hammersmith Bridge, because we felt it no longer held a systemic risk to the council. It is always obviously a risk. There are continuing problems, but we're well aware of that. To pick up on David's point of going forward, a new risk register is in evolution, picking up on the text here, making it more clear to understand, but with more specific mitigations, or as in the case of cyber, which is really something as we have to live with this. And as long as we're sort of aware of it and we know what we're doing, we can actually respond in some case or fatal form. There will be a cyber attack. We know that they happen every day in actual fact. So we need to be aware of that. In most cases, a new risk register with defined actions, responsibilities and owners will be put together. And we're beginning to roll it out even now. So we're sort of testing it with some of the teams, for instance, Sukhvinder's team, to see how it operates. But reducing the number of risks could also be preferential.
Thank you. Are there any questions from members of the committee? Councillor Holman.
Just an observation, really. If we're looking at the red risks, we've already talked about cyber. I mean, we're always going to be red, I think. I don't think there's any way of escaping that because we can just never keep up with the technology that gazumps us, if you like. So that's always going to be a problem. But looking at the other red risk, which is complaints, then that is one that we can resolve. And I think we are resolving, and we'll be back at the audit committee at some point to show the progress we've made.
That's a really good point, Councillor Holman. Sorry. I think that's something Sharon's chief exec has been very focused on with her SLT. I think you're right. I think we're going in the right direction. I think there's work still to be done, but it'd be good to bring perhaps a more detailed piece back to the committee to a future meeting to give you that assurance as well.
Obviously, I've picked up on the red ones there. Is there anything in the yellow that you feel like we might want to think about a bit more?
I think the one that obviously Sukhvinder's section 151 will not keep him awake at night, but he's working hard on is the medium-term financial strategy. I know Councillor Rhea as well, but I know there's lots of good work being done at Hammersmith, both in terms of the in-year position, but also looking at the long term. So I think, again, as with many authorities, that's something that is a pretty borderline. But I think because of what we're doing here, there's good control, good mitigation in place. But happy to defer to Councillors Rhea and Sukhvinder.
Okay, Councillor Chivot-Verdier.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I'm reminded of the debate we've had in this committee previously, where there were recommendations around the number of risks and the approach that we've chosen as an administration to take, which is we've accepted that we have more risks, but we have people who own those risks and follow up on that. So it's reassuring to know that you feel there is that ownership and willingness to ask. I wanted to ask about one specific risk, which was number 10, which is stuff around the Building Safety Act, and it's that when I was reading it, so you see that we've submitted 26 building safety cases, and I thought, what about the other 23? It's made clear on page 79 that we've actually only been invited by the regulator to submit these cases. you tell us that you've hired 2 permanent staff to help with that, and there's another 23. Do you feel that you're now sufficiently resourced to operate with this? And is this something we need to do annually, or is this sort of a one-off? How does that? Could you tell us a bit more about that?
So in terms of the building safety regulator, so every authority was required to register high-rise buildings by September last year, and then to be invited, which again Hammersmith did within the timescale, which is really good for the 49 high-rise buildings. The regulator then invites authorities to submit building safety cases, which are very detailed submissions around the safety, the construction and the safety arrangements for each of those individual buildings. And that involves resident consultation as well as all the technical material as well. So again, there are very detailed documents there. Now, the regulator is meant to review and respond to and certify those building safety cases in a relatively reasonable timescale. We know across London so far that several hundred building safety cases have been submitted. Authorities have been asked lots of questions around those building safety cases. I think Hammersmith actually has had much fewer questions asked because of the quality of those building safety cases, which is really good to hear. So I think, typically we're looking at 25 to 30 questions per building safety case here, where some authorities are being asked 100, 150 questions on each of these documents. They've yet to certify across London a single building safety case. There's a real backlog and a real issue with capacity in the building safety regulator, which has been raised by the network of London housing directors, for example. It's being raised by building control functions as well, because there are also implications for authorities and other developers who want to either build new high-rise or build new developments, because they have to go through a process now with the building safety regulator rather than with building control. So again, there are backlogs there in terms of some new developments as well. So there's an estimate, I think, of something in the order of 100,000 new homes being delayed in London because of the delays in the building safety regulator process. But it's safe to say Hammersmith is doing really well in terms of what it's required to do, and it's making those submissions. They're good quality submissions, and the building safety managers, that's their responsibility is to maintain those building safety cases throughout the building life. So again, we're not required to submit annually, but we are required to submit on a risk assessment basis. I think the regulator, once it's caught up, will have a think about how often it wants to then revisit those. But yes. So again, I think it's important those resources are there to make sure those building safety cases are maintained, that residents are reassured, and part of that, as I said, is consultation with residents. So I think a good job's being done by colleagues here, Hammersmith and Fulham, in that regard.
Yeah, just on that point, I think most of those buildings will be our council homes tower blocks. Is that right? Over a certain number of stories. Yeah, it's very interesting that the regulator's not caught up with us and other councils on that one. It's actually quite a serious thing for them not to have caught up on, I would have said.
It is. It's buildings over 18 metres or 7 stories. The Grenfell inquiry was recommending the government reassess its definition of high-rise buildings to 11 metres and above. So again, that would create more building safety cases for the authority to produce and more work for the building safety regulator.
Councillor Chivot-Verdier.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I'm not just saying this because I worked at a regulator unrelated to housing, and I'm soon to work at another one. There is chronic understaffing of regulators. I think we should also recognise that. There is a habit of slapping on requirements and deadlines, and teams of 10 people having to deal with, as you've said, hundreds and hundreds of requirements just for this city alone. About the 26th that you've submitted, the councillor said rightly that that's going to be many of our council buildings, but that's not just council-owned buildings, is it? Does that also include private buildings?
So there will be private owners of buildings who will also have had to submit building safety cases on top of local authorities, but we won't have the information until those certificates are published. So again, that's something for residents who live in private blocks. There'll be mechanisms there. They should be being engaged by their landlord or building owner as part of the building safety case development.
That's very helpful, thank you. And what control do we have over that?
So we don't have any direct control. I think I'll take away the question there about what we have in terms of enforcement powers. I'm happy to take that away and come back to the committee with an answer.
It's also the case that we don't know which housing association blocks fall into that category and have details of that either. So, and that wasn't shared with us way back when this first became a requirement.
Councillor Morton.
Thank you, Chair. I think it might come under item 10 and really relates back to what Councillor Homan was saying. I've got a couple of instances in my ward of buildings that have been started and then never finished. Basically, the developer's gone bust. One of them had appalling, I got constant complaints about the obvious lack of safety control and that it's just in a derelict state. I understand that until recently, you've got your building safety officers, but almost all building control officers seem to be self-employed. And in this one case, I tracked them back and it's the contractor has basically employed himself as the building control officer. Do we have any plans for being able to curtail that? I know we can't do anything to stop people from, to make people finish buildings, but it does seem to be a bit of a loophole.
Happy to take that away, Councillor Morton, in terms of the specific, which sounds quite concerning. I think the other thing I would say is that as, again, building control, local authority functions also have responsibilities for dangerous structures. So if there's something there you think is in that sort of neck of the woods, then the building control team will be able to advise.
Okay, I'll come back to you on that, but I did take it up and I was told that we had absolutely no way of enforcing it.
Okay.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Morton. I'm going to then move to recommendations. So this is the one for this, and is the report noted?
Noted.
Excellent. In that case, we move along to item 8, global internal audit standards for information only. And this paper is just as an informative. And could I ask David and Moira to introduce the item?
Thank you, Chair. So I think we've touched on the global internal audit standards earlier in the meeting. I think it was helpful just to give some more background information for the committee. So obviously we're now, looking to implement from the 1st of April. There's some good work being done by the London Local Authority Audit Committee Chairs Forum, which I think the Chair has may have attended before, which City of London host. So some of the documentation has come through that route there as well. I think for me, the key takeaway here is as we report on our audit work, we will report to you on the gap analysis we're doing against the standards to show to you where we do comply and where we've still got some work to do to make sure we're fully compliant. But that's something we'll bring in our audit reporting going forward. But really to give a bit more background to the committee about the standards and about your role within that as well. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, David. Are there any questions? Councillor Schwab-Verdier.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to pass over the slide typo on page 85 that names RBKC rather than RBHF, but there's no bad blood between ourselves and our lovely neighbours to the east.
I'll apologise immediately.
It comes from a place of love.
Find and replace with
But I did have a question about the document that you've shared about from the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors. So it's on page 91 of the report. There are 3 recommendations made, such as having an agenda item covering the transition at every audit committee, deep dives, appointment of an independent third party. However much we love the work that you do, there's also a slight concern about workload, and that there's a recommendation for a full gap analysis. So I wondered if you could tell us more about, the global internal audit standards when that came out and that was published. You say that the industry fed back on this. What was the industry's view about that proposal? Where did we push back? Where did we not push back? And then about these 3 recommendations on page 91, which are we taking?
I'll take the first point, the first point first about the consultation. So there was a lengthy consultation period. We know there was lots of feedback across the globe from different sectors. We know in particular local government in the UK fed back quite strongly that the standards did not give enough recognition of public sector and local government in particular in terms of some of the requirements. So things like, for example, the remuneration of the head of audit is meant to be considered by the board. So in local government, that's not, the head of paid service, the chief executive determines pay and grading matters, not the audit committee or the full council. So things like that were very generic, but very much private sector aimed. So this is where the public sector application note published by the ISAB helps to some extent, and CITFA's code of practice as well. So we are able to now rely on those documents as to what we have to do rather than try and comply with the letter of some of those things which are not strictly relevant for public sector UK in the global standards. Yeah.
Something that's also been discussed quite a lot is that sometimes you won't be fully compliant in some of those areas, but you may do something different that is okay. And as long as you say that, that's part of the gap analysis that we need to do, is like, well, this isn't possible because of this, but we do this instead. That's acceptable. But it's a good thing to do, to go through and assess yourself against it. And we've kind of done quite a lot of that already. And we've had a huge amount of consultation with other London boroughs, wider than London, huge feedback. In fact, we're a little bit ahead of some of them in actually getting to where we are with showing what we want to do through our strategy and showing how we will be compliant. But that's it's a good opportunity once you've had a chance to digest it. It's quite a lot of information here, but to ask us those sort of questions and say, well, how do you do this? And why haven't you told us about this? Or do we do this any differently? But it's good to have standards that will work across all of us, and we will need to be externally assessed as well. So we had an assessment last year.
Yeah.
So it would be similar to that, but it's against a slightly different measure. And it's good to show that we are consistent.
And in terms of those three particular recommendations on page 91, so as Moira says, we're already working through that gap analysis. So I think what we'll do is bring a summary of some of the key points to you as part of our audit update. So rather than a whole separate report, we'll just give you some assurance about some of the key things we're working on. I think the deep dives will be a conversation through that about whether there's particular areas you'd like us to focus on in more detail, with either through a briefing or through a formal report to the committee. As Moira has already identified, we will need to have every 5 years that independent external assessment. So that's changed to some degree from the previous arrangements where we were able to operate peer reviews across London, where we were ensuring there was no conflicts between authorities who were reviewing each other. So you couldn't review each other to review somebody else. But this will put in place an accreditation process that the IIA will supervise. So independent third parties will be potentially able to do that for us. But I think it's a good discipline for us as internal auditors. There's a bit about who audits the auditors. So not marking our own homework. So there's a good rigor to that, but it's every 5 years. So that gap analysis will build up to our self-assessment for when we have the review done in a couple of 3 years' time.
I just wanted to come in on this point. Obviously, the principle is rather good, as you say. Marking your own homework does leave open to question marks, but obviously we've been on this committee for a while, and we're all aware of the acute shortage of people within the audit space, and particularly if you're having to go externally now to get that validation every 5 years. Obviously, we spent a lot of work in the last few years getting our own annual accounts up to date. Is there a risk here, given the acute shortage, that this sort of accreditation gets delayed by no fault of your own, but because of an existing acute shortage? And as on top of that, the addition of new best practices that we've kind of seen being rolled out on a fairly regular basis at the moment?
Yes, I think that's a really good question, actually. I think there's a number of bits to pick up on there. So as heads of audit across London and across the UK, we're looking at ways in which perhaps we should be looking to get accredited for doing some of these assessments, maybe. So we avoid the charging element, which is something that has been good in the peer review so far. I think recruitment in the audit space is a challenge, in the internal audit space, both for us and for the firms. I think what we're doing in our shared service, which we want to do more of at Hammersmith and Fulham, is look how we grow our own talent. So bringing in more apprenticeships, so less reliance on the external provision, more reliance on an in-house function with apprenticeships and a structure that will develop. I know that fits in well with Hammersmith and Fulham's priorities as well. So it's something we're keen to work on, and it will actually deliver some savings as well going forward. So that's something we're keen to see, how we get the best use of our resource, but actually have the best service we can provide, and actually having staff on the ground doing that is a really good way of doing it, and growing our talent internally.
Yeah, that sounds ideal, just in terms of this, for what space is. Councillor Chevot-Verdier.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, absolutely. You made a very good point. And I was glad to see that sort of staff retention and development featuring in the first times that we reviewed tonight. It's good that it's you're thinking about this. Of course, when we talk about accreditation, I automatically think about UCAS certified firms that can do the accreditation. I think about low numbers, quasi-monopoly, and spiraling costs. So we'll be looking forward to
Mike David.
So we'll report back on that. It's something the sector and the EIA, as the lead institute, has got get its head around how it's going to do this, and help organisations like ourselves to do it in a cost-effective and a timely manner.
That's good, and I'm glad that regulation seems to be outcomes focused rather than processes focused. So sort of FCI handbook kind of style. This is the outcome we want. Kind of get there however you want. But so then, what I'm wondering is, this gap analysis is that going to be annual?
The self-assessment is something we should review annually to feed into the head of audit annual report. So that gap analysis will feed into that. So we will keep refreshing it each year to make sure it's up to date. So I mean, some things will change.
Good.
From time to time.
So that's possible. So if I understand that going forward, you'll have an annual cycle of reviewing the sort of gap analysis, but an accreditation every 5 years. Is that correct? So beyond the point of accreditations are very pass or fail kind of exercises, whereas in the annual analysis process, then we have a chance to engage. But actually, who do we engage with? Is that the institutes of?
So I suppose on the first level, you'd engage with us in terms of what we're saying about the self-assessment, and what we do when we have the external assessment is bring the external assessor along to the committee to have the conversation as well. But so it's basically down to us in the intervening period to inform you of the work we've done, to look at the gaps, to assure you whether the gaps are there and whether the material or what steps we're taking to address them. So that's the thing we will do on that regular basis.
Yeah, and thank you for your patience with my questions. I'm trying to get my head around it. It would be good to have a sort of annual engagement to make sure that we stay on the right path and that we don't have a massive panic 6 months before accreditation is due. So is that through the provision of an independent member to this committee? Is that through bringing someone, inviting them as a guest? Or
well, we can think about how we involve the committee in that, and that's something more than happy to do. So we'll put some thought into that as well. So rather than just presenting it to you at year end, we can have a think about how we do that a bit more collaboratively as well.
Absolutely, but it's again, in the knowledge the regulators don't like to give you informal advice as to whether you're compliant or not outside of formal reviews. Is how do we get that assurance that your annual, whilst we believe that you'll deliver quality work, sometimes what we understand to be the right thing can be quite different from where particularly new regulators and institute to have to put in place new rules, understand. So how do we sort of make sure that we stay aligned on our vision of the world?
So the regulator won't get involved in that process. But I think what we have the opportunity as a committee is, if you want us to bring forward the external assessment, that's another way. If you've got concerns or want to get that independent assurance sooner, we can do that. So there's nothing that says you have to wait the 5 years. So there are mechanisms there. We can think about whether some sort of critical friend role maybe the independent member could play as well, or the COPD could play on the committee.
And this is just a thought at this point. Let's talk about this some more. But something that isn't just every 5 years could be reassuring for yourselves as much as for members of the public. So yeah, I guess continue to think about that.
Yeah, there seems to be a good point in that, particularly if this is going to be a new standard. I'm sure if we are one of the first coming forward, we will inevitably be the ones that people look to see how we end up performing as the basis for how other councils inevitably shape and form as they prepare for their own assessments as well. Is there any final questions? Okay. In that case, I'm going to move to the recommendations. There are 2 recommendations here: to note the content of the report and refer to the guidance found at appendices 1 through 3, and 2, to request a further report on the implementation of the standards once the relevant sector guidance has been published, including any actions identified and taken as a result of the gap analysis which will be carried out. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Excellent. And that finally takes us to item 9, date of our next meeting, which is the 9th of June 25, the 22nd of September 25, 1st of December 25, 16th of March 26, and the 8th of June 2026, which will also be in the next administration. God, time flies. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you all. I'm going to close this evening's meeting, and have a good evening.